When Brielle Hargrove placed $20,000 in $20 bills stacked neatly on the counter and said she wanted to make a deposit, Brooke did not process the transaction. Instead, she questioned Brielle about where the money came from. She said, "People like you do not usually make deposits like that." She demanded identification and then stepped away from the window to call the police and report suspected fraud or drug money. When the officer Grant Ellison arrived, he treated Brielle like a criminal. He shouted at her, threatened her with arrest, ignored her explanations, and when she finally identified herself as the chief executive of the bank, both Brooke and Grant dismissed it as a lie. Grant handcuffed her right there in the middle of the lobby. Neither of them had any idea what they were about to discover in the most humiliating way possible, that Brielle Hargrove was not lying and that their racist assumptions had just destroyed their careers and would cost the city more than $1 million. Before we continue, where are you watching from? What city or country? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you are tuning in from, and if you believe no one should be treated like a criminal for making illegal bank deposits simply because of their race, give this video a like and subscribe. Brielle Hargrove had been up since early that morning. She had flown into Charlotte from New York for a routine quarterly business review at the regional office, the kind of visit she made several times a year to oversee branch performance, meet with district managers, and review expansion plans. Her assistant, Lila Chen, had scheduled the day with back-to-back meetings starting later, but Brielle had one personal errand she wanted to handle first. She had $20,000 in cash in her leather bag, intended for the closing of a real estate investment later that week, and rather than carry it with her to additional meetings and a return flight to New York, she decided to deposit it that morning. She texted Lila, "I am stopping by the Charlotte branch for a quick deposit. I will see you at the office afterward." It was supposed to be quick. Brielle Hargrove had spent years climbing the ranks at Summit Federal Bank. She had started as a branch manager in Brooklyn, moved up to regional director in Philadelphia, then to executive vice president in Boston, and years ago she was named chief executive of the entire institution. She oversaw hundreds of branches across multiple states, including the Charlotte branch she was about to walk into. She had personally approved its construction budget years earlier, but that morning she was not dressed like a chief executive. She was dressed like a woman who had taken an early flight and valued comfort over appearance when she was not in the public eye. Dark jeans, a black blazer, white sneakers, a leather bag over her shoulder, reading glasses tucked in her pocket. No jewelry except the watch her father had given her when she became vice president. She entered the Summit Federal Bank branch on West Trade Street and joined the line behind 4 other customers, waiting her turn just like everyone else. The lobby buzzed with the busy morning rush. People were depositing checks, withdrawing cash, and opening accounts. The tellers behind the counter handled transactions with practiced efficiency. Brielle watched them work and made mental notes. Customer wait times seemed reasonable. The signage could be clearer. One of the deposit form dispensers was empty. When her turn came, she stepped up to the counter where a young woman sat behind the glass partition. Blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail, sharp features, name tag reading Brooke Simmons. Brooke had worked at this branch for years and in that time had developed very specific ideas about what kind of customers made large deposits and what kind of customers were up to something they should not be. Her supervisors had documented complaints from minority customers over the years, all claiming Brooke had treated them differently, questioned them more aggressively, and made assumptions based on appearance. The complaints had been filed, noted, and ignored. Brooke looked up as Brielle approached, and the moment she registered who stood in front of her, a black woman in jeans and sneakers, something in her expression changed. Her eyes moved from Brielle's face to her clothes, to her worn leather bag, and the professional courtesy that had been there a second earlier chilled into something completely different. "Good morning," Brielle said with a smile. "I would like to make a deposit." Brooke's reply was flat. "Account card." Brielle placed it on the counter. Brooke picked it up, glanced at it without really reading, and set it aside. "What are you depositing today?" Brielle opened her bag and pulled out the stack of cash, $20,000 in 20s, carefully wrapped and counted. She set it on the counter between them. Brooke stared at the money. Her eyes lingered on it for a long moment before returning to Brielle's face. "That is a large amount of cash." "It is," Brielle said calmly. "Where did you get it?" The question landed wrong. Brielle had made hundreds of deposits over the years in dozens of branches across the country, and no teller had ever started with that. She kept her tone steady. "I am depositing it into my account. That is all you need to process the transaction." Brooke leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. People like you do not usually make deposits like that, not dressed like that. There it was. Brielle felt the words settle in the air between them and understood immediately what Brooke meant by people like you. She had heard variations of it her entire life in boardrooms, in interviews, in spaces where people looked at her and decided she did not belong before she even opened her mouth, but she stayed calm. I would like to make my deposit. Can you process it, please? I need to verify your identity. You already have my account card. I need to see your identification. Brielle glanced to her left. The customer, who had been in line ahead of her, a white man in his 50s wearing a polo shirt, had deposited what looked like a similar amount of cash only minutes earlier. Brooke had not asked him for identification. She had not asked where his money came from. She had processed his transaction in under 2 minutes and smiled as he left. Brielle looked back at Brooke. You did not ask the customer ahead of me for identification. Brooke's jaw tightened. That is the protocol. I need to verify or I cannot proceed. Brielle took her driver's license from her wallet and placed it on the counter without another word. Brooke picked it up and examined it closely. Her eyes narrowed as she read the name Brielle Hargrove. She did not recognize it. She did not recognize the face, and Brooke Simmons had worked at this branch for years, long enough, in her opinion, to know every high-value customer who walked through that door, long enough to believe she could tell who belonged and who did not. She looked at Brielle again. Casual clothes, $20,000 in cash, a name she did not know. Brooke made a decision. I need to verify this more thoroughly before I can proceed. Give me a moment. She stood up, taking the identification and account card with her, and walked away from the counter toward the back office. Brielle remained at the counter and waited. The stack of money sat there untouched. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. Other customers in line glanced over, sensing something was wrong. The teller at the next station looked uncomfortable, but kept her head down and said nothing. After several more minutes, Brielle checked her phone for the time. She had a meeting coming up. This was taking longer than it should. In the back office, Brooke Simmons was on the phone speaking in a low, urgent voice to a 911 dispatcher. There is a black woman at Summit Federal Bank on West Trade trying to deposit what I believe is stolen or drug money. She has $20,000 in cash, and her story does not add up. You need to send someone right now. She gave the address, hung up, and stayed in the back office. Brielle waited at the counter a few minutes more. Then she saw the police car pull up outside. Officer Grant Ellison stepped out, adjusted his belt, and walked through the front door with the posture of a man who had already decided what kind of situation he was walking into. He had been on the force for years and had responded to calls like this before, calls about suspicious activity, about people who did not seem to belong, about cash that did not add up. He scanned the lobby and his eyes landed on Brielle, the only black woman standing at the counter. He walked straight toward her. Brooke came out of the back office at that exact moment. Seeing Grant, she pointed at Brielle and said loudly, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear, "It is her. She is the one trying to deposit illegal money." Every customer in the building turned to look. Brielle remained perfectly still. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply looked at Brooke, then at Officer Grant Ellison, and understood with perfect clarity that this was about to get much worse before it got better. Grant stopped directly in front of her, with his hands resting on his belt. "Ma'am, where did you get this cash?" Brielle opened her mouth to answer. Grant cut her off before she could speak, his voice sharp and loud enough to carry across the entire lobby. "Think carefully about how you answer that question, ma'am. I am tired of your people always committing crimes." Brielle stood at the counter with 30 people staring at her, and a police officer who had just told her he was tired of her people demanding an explanation for cash that belonged to her. She took a deep breath, kept her voice steady, and said exactly what was true. "The money is mine. I earned it. I am here to deposit it into my account. I do not understand what is happening here." Officer Grant Ellison's expression did not change. He looked at her the way someone looks at a lie they have heard 100 times before. "What is happening here is that people like you do not walk around with $20,000 in cash unless it is stolen or fraudulent. Either prove how you got this money right now, or you are going to be arrested." Brooke stepped up to the counter, with her arms still crossed, nodding. "I know all of our customers. I have worked here for years. I know what they look like and how they dress." She gestured openly at Brielle's jeans and sneakers. "Someone dressed like that does not walk around with that much money unless it is stolen, drug money." Brielle felt the room closing in, but she did not raise her voice. She looked directly at Grant and said what she had been thinking since the moment she walked in. "This is because I am black. Grant's face hardened immediately. There it is. Your people always play the race card the moment you get caught. Your kind disgusts me. He held out his hand. Give me the identification now. Brielle had already given her driver's license to Brooke, but Brooke was holding it like evidence rather than documentation. Grant snatched it from Brooke's hands and examined it with the same skepticism Brooke had shown. He read the name Brielle Hargrove, and it meant nothing to him. He looked at the address, looked at Brielle, and his expression said he had already decided what kind of person she was. What do you do for a living? I am an executive. Grant let out a short, sarcastic laugh. Yeah, right, executive. He turned to Brooke. What kind of business? Brooke shook her head. She has been vague, especially since she walked in. Brielle spoke up, her voice firm but not loud. I have not been vague about anything. I came here to make a deposit. That is all I have tried to do. Grant ignored her completely. He pulled out his radio and spoke into it while looking straight at Brielle, running the identification. Wait! Then he looked at her again, with his hand resting on his belt near the handcuffs. Do not move from that spot. Do you understand? Brielle nodded once, and in that moment, while Grant waited for the identification check to come back, and while Brooke stood behind the counter looking satisfied as every customer in the lobby watched the scene unfold, Brielle pulled her phone from her pocket and typed quickly. I am being detained at the Charlotte branch. They called the police. They are accusing me of depositing illegal money. Come now, full security. She hit send and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Grant's radio crackled. The voice on the other end confirmed what Brielle already knew. The identification was clean, no warrants, no criminal record, nothing. Grant looked at the radio as if it had given him the wrong information. He looked back at Brielle and, instead of apologizing or reconsidering, he doubled down. You are being detained for further verification. We are going to the station to sort this out. Brielle's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. You are arresting me. Why? For suspected fraud and for failing to provide an adequate explanation of the source of the funds. I told you the money is mine. My identification is clean. You do not have probable cause. Grant stepped closer. I have plenty of cause. Now turn around. Brielle did not move. I am not going anywhere. I need to tell you something, and you need to listen. Grant's hand moved toward his handcuffs. Turn around. Last warning. Brielle spoke quickly, looking him straight in the eyes. My name is Brielle Hargrove. I am the chief executive of Summit Federal Bank. This bank, the one you are standing in right now. She had flown from New York that morning to make a deposit at her own institution. She reached into her bag and pulled out her official chief executive identification card, the one with her photo, her title, and the Summit Federal Bank logo embossed at the top. She held it up so Grant and Brooke could see it. Brooke looked at the card, looked at Brielle, and then burst out laughing. It was a loud, sharp, dismissive laugh. The chief executive is in New York, and she would never be someone dressed like you. That is a lie. Grant looked at the identification card, chuckled, and shook his head. Not surprised. People like you will say anything to avoid being arrested. You think I'm stupid? Brielle tried to speak again, tried to explain, but Grant was done listening. He grabbed her arm, spun her around, and forced her hands behind her back. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, and Brielle felt their weight, not just the physical weight, but the weight of what this moment meant. She stood in her own bank, in a building whose construction budget she had approved, in a lobby where her executive portrait hung on the wall in the back hallway, and she was being arrested because a teller and a police officer could not process the idea that a black woman in casual clothes could be the person in charge. Grant's voice was in her ear now, low and satisfied. You are under arrest for suspected fraud and obstruction. You have the right to remain silent. Brielle did not remain silent. Her voice rang through the entire lobby. I am the chief executive of this bank. My assistant is on the way. You are making the biggest mistake of your career. Brooke stepped out from behind the counter, moving toward the stack of cash that still sat on the counter. Grant gestured. Bag that money. We will need it as evidence. Brooke pulled out a large plastic evidence bag and began stuffing the stacked bills inside, handling them as if they were contraband rather than legitimate funds from a legitimate account holder. Brielle watched her do it. She watched Grant standing beside her with a hand on her arm and understood that neither of them believed a word she had said. A customer near the door, a middle-aged woman who had been watching the entire interaction, pulled out her phone and began recording. Another customer, a man in a suit, spoke up. Officer, I think you should verify what she is saying before you take her out of here. Grant turned on him immediately. Sir, step back. This does not concern you. The man stood firm. I am just saying she has been calm the whole time. She is cooperating. Maybe you should check. Step back now. The man stepped back but did not put his phone away. Grant turned Brielle toward the door, his grip firm on her arm. Brooke had finished bagging the money and held it like a trophy. Brielle looked around the lobby one last time at the customers who were watching, at the tellers behind the counter who looked uncomfortable but said nothing, at Brooke who looked vindicated, at Grant who looked like he had just closed the case. And then she heard it, the sound of car doors closing outside, multiple car doors at once. Grant heard it too. He paused, still holding Brielle's arm, and turned toward the main entrance. 3 black SUVs had pulled up directly in front of the bank, parked at sharp angles as if they had arrived in a hurry. The doors opened simultaneously and 6 men in black suits stepped out. They moved with precision and purpose, and at the front of them, walking fast with a tablet in her hand and an expression fixed in fury, was Lila Park. She pushed through the main doors of the bank, and her eyes found Brielle immediately, handcuffed and standing beside a police officer in the middle of the lobby. Lila's voice cut through the entire building like a blade. "Release that woman right now!" Lila did not wait for a response. She crossed the lobby in quick strides, her heels striking the marble floor like shots, and the 6 men in black suits fanned out behind her in a formation that made it very clear they were not there to negotiate. She stopped a few feet from Officer Grant Ellison. She looked at Brielle in handcuffs and then directed all her attention to Grant with an expression that could have peeled paint off a wall. "Do you know who you just handcuffed?" Grant's grip on Brielle's arm tightened slightly, but his voice stayed firm. He had dealt with angry family members before, angry friends, angry lawyers, and he was not going to be intimidated by a woman with a tablet and a security team. "Ma'am, step back. This is an arrest." Lila did not step back. She moved closer. "I asked you a question, officer. Do you know who this woman is? She's under arrest for suspected fraud and failure to provide proof." Lila's voice was loud enough now for everyone in the lobby to hear every word. "Her name is Brielle Hargrove. She is the chief executive of Summit Federal Bank. This bank, the one you are standing in, the one that employs everyone behind that counter, whose logo is on your uniform because your department banks here." Grant's expression flickered for half a second, but he recovered quickly. "She claimed that. I do not believe her." Lila raised her tablet and turned it toward Grant's face. On the screen was Brielle's executive profile from the Summit Federal Bank website. Her photograph, the same face Grant was looking at right now. Her title, Chief Executive of Summit Federal Bank. Her biography listing years with the company and years as Chief Executive overseeing branches across multiple states. Grant looked at the screen. His hand was still on Brielle's arm, but his fingers had loosened slightly. Lila turned the tablet toward Brooke, who still stood behind the counter holding the bag of money as if she had just solved a crime. "You called the police on her, your chief executive, the woman who runs this entire institution." Brooke's face had gone pale, but her mouth opened anyway. The words came out in a defensive rush. "I did not know. She did not say anything. She just walked in, dressed like that." "And she told you who she was?" Lila's voice was cold and precise. "She showed you identification. She explained she was making a deposit, and you decided she was a criminal because of how she was dressed and the color of her skin." Brooke tried again. "I was just being thorough. I have worked here for years and I know our customers." "You know your customers." Lila turned to one of the security men behind her and nodded. He stepped forward, pulled a folder from his briefcase, and handed it to Lila. She opened it without taking her eyes off Brooke. "Let me tell you what I know about you, Brooke Simmons. You have been employed at this branch for years. In that time, there have been multiple formal complaints filed against you by minority customers. All the complaints cited the same behavior: excessive questioning, demands for additional identification, accusations of fraudulent activity. All the complaints were documented by your supervisor and dismissed as misunderstandings." Brooke's face went from pale to white. Lila kept reading. "Months ago, a black man tried to deposit $8,000 in cash. You questioned him for minutes, demanded 3 forms of identification, and suggested he was involved in illegal activity. He filed a complaint. It was dismissed. Months before that, a Latina woman tried to cash a check for thousands. You made her wait while you verified the check, even though it was drawn on an account at this bank. She filed a complaint. It was dismissed." Lila closed the folder and looked at Brooke as if she were looking at something that had rotted in the sun. "You have a pattern, Brooke, and today you acted on it again. Only this time the person you profiled was not just another customer. She was your boss." Brooke opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Grant finally spoke, and his voice had lost some of its certainty. She did not identify herself correctly. If she had just said from the beginning, Lila turned on him like a whip. She told you she was the chief executive. You laughed in her face. She did not have proof. She showed you her chief executive identification card. You called it a lie. Grant's jaw tightened. He looked at Brielle's identification card, which still lay on the counter where he had tossed it after deciding it was fake. Lila stepped forward, picked it up, and held it in front of his face. Official Chief Executive Credentials of Summit Federal Bank. Brielle's name, Brielle's face. The corporate seal embossed in gold. Does this look like a lie to you, Officer Grant? Grant said nothing. Lila pointed to the walls around them. Do you see that hallway behind the teller stations? The one leading to the executive offices. She pointed. Walk down that hallway right now. Third door on the right. There is a portrait of every chief executive this bank has ever had. Brielle Hargrove is one of them. Her photo hangs on that wall. It has been there for years. Grant did not move. One of the customers who had been recording the entire interaction spoke from near the door. I will check. He walked toward the hallway, disappeared for a few seconds, and returned. She is right. There is an entire wall of portraits back there. Brielle Hargrove, chief executive. Her photo hangs right next to the founder. The lobby fell completely silent. Lila turned back to Grant. Take the handcuffs off her right now. Grant hesitated. His hand was still on Brielle's arm, and the handcuffs were still locked around her wrists, and he stood in the middle of a situation that had just flipped completely. He looked at Brooke, as if maybe she had something to say that would make this make sense again. Brooke stared at the floor. Grant reached for his keys and unlocked the handcuffs. Brielle brought her hands forward and rubbed her wrists where the metal had been. She still said nothing. She simply stood there, breathing slowly while Grant stepped back and tried to figure out what to do with his hands. Lila was not finished. She turned to Brooke. You called 911 and reported suspected fraud. You told the dispatcher that a black woman was trying to deposit stolen or drug money. You made that call without verifying a single fact. You made that call because you saw a black woman with cash and decided she was a criminal. Brooke's voice came out small and shaky. I was just trying to protect the bank. You were trying to protect the bank. Lila repeated the words slowly, as if she were tasting them, coming from her own chief executive. Brooke had no response to that. Brielle finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but it carried through the entire lobby, and every person in that building heard every word. I walked into my own bank this morning to make a simple deposit. I waited in line like every other customer. I reached the counter and I was treated like a suspect from the first second. Not because I did anything wrong, not because my money was suspicious, not because I could not provide identification, but because you saw a black woman in casual clothes and decided I did not belong here. She looked at Brooke. You questioned me. You demanded my identification. You left me standing at that counter for minutes while you called the police and reported me for a crime I did not commit. And when I told you who I was, you laughed. Then she looked at Grant. You walked in here already convinced I was guilty. You shouted at me. You threatened me. You told me you were tired of my kind. You checked my identification and it came back clean. And still you decided to arrest me. And when I told you I was the chief executive of this bank, you called me a liar and put handcuffs on me. She raised her wrists, where the red marks from the handcuffs were still visible. I have spent years building a career in this industry. I have worked in branches like this. I have processed deposits, like the one I tried to make today. I have dealt with customers, with employees, with regulators, with boards, with investors. I have done everything right. And today I was arrested in my own building because two people looked at me and saw a criminal instead of a chief executive. The silence in the lobby was absolute. Brielle turned to Brooke. You are fired effective immediately. Security will escort you out. Brooke's eyes widened. Wait, please. I did not mean. It was exactly what you meant. You have been doing it for years. It ends now. Two of the men in black suits moved toward Brooke. She looked around the lobby as if someone might step in and save her, but no one moved. The other tellers behind the counter looked away. The branch manager, who had finally come out of his office during the commotion, said nothing. Brooke was escorted out of the building with trembling hands and tears streaking her face. Brielle turned to Grant. You will hear from my lawyer. I will file a federal civil rights lawsuit and push for your termination and a full investigation of your conduct. Grant tried to speak. Ma'am, I was responding to a call. I did not know. You did not listen. There is a difference. Lila stepped forward and handed Brielle her bag, her identification, and her chief executive card. Brielle took them, slung the bag over her shoulder, and looked around the lobby one last time, at the customers who had witnessed everything, at the tellers who had stayed silent, at the counter where her $20,000 still sat in an evidence bag. She stepped forward, picked up the bag, opened it, and took out the cash. She placed it on the counter in front of the branch manager, who looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Process the deposit. He nodded quickly, his hands clumsy with the bills. Brielle turned and walked toward the door. Lila and the security team followed, and as she stepped out into the morning sunlight, every person in that lobby knew exactly what they had just witnessed. The end of 2 careers and the beginning of accountability. The video was everywhere by midday. 4 different customers had recorded the incident from 4 different angles, and by the time Brielle's legal team sent the official statement, the footage had already been viewed millions of times. Within days, it had reached tens of millions. Every major news outlet covered the story with variations of the same headline: Chief Executive handcuffed in her own bank. Black executive arrested for depositing cash. Racist teller calls police on her boss. The image that spread fastest was a freeze frame from one of the videos showing Brielle standing in handcuffs in the middle of the Summit Federal Bank lobby, while Brooke Simmons stood behind the counter holding the bag of money like evidence. Brooke Simmons was fired within hours of the incident. Summit Federal Bank issued a statement calling her actions a violation of company policy and federal anti-discrimination laws, and announced she would not be eligible for rehire at any branch. But the firing was only the beginning. Brielle's legal team, working with the district attorney, filed criminal charges against Brooke for filing a false police report. The case went to trial months later, and the jury took less than 2 hours to return a guilty verdict. Brooke was sentenced to months in county jail and years of probation. She was also banned for life from working in the banking industry, and at a young age with a criminal record and her name permanently tied to one of the most widely shared racial profiling videos in the country, Brooke Simmons' career had ended before it had really begun. The consequences for Officer Grant Ellison came just as quickly. He was placed on administrative leave the same day as the incident, and the Charlotte Police Department launched an internal investigation that revealed a pattern of conduct they could no longer ignore. During his years on the force, Grant had been the subject of multiple formal complaints related to racially biased policing. All the complaints had been investigated and dismissed, but when viewed together as a pattern rather than isolated incidents, the picture was unmistakable. Grant had a history of treating Black and Latino residents with suspicion, aggression, and disrespect. The body camera footage from the bank showed him telling Brielle he was tired of her kind, and that statement alone was enough to violate multiple department policies. He was fired weeks after the incident. His appeal was denied. At his age, with no other law enforcement agency willing to hire him and his name tied to a viral video, Grant Ellison's police career was over. Brielle filed the federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Grant Ellison and the city of Charlotte weeks after the incident. The lawsuit sought over $1 million in damages and demanded systemic reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. The charges included illegal detention, false arrest, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, and racial discrimination. The city's legal team reviewed the evidence, multiple videos, witness statements, body camera footage, Grant's history of complaints, and the documented pattern of discriminatory behavior from Brooke, and they made the decision to settle rather than go to trial. They knew no jury would be on their side. The settlement was finalized for the full amount demanded within months and came with a list of mandatory reforms that Brielle had insisted upon. The Charlotte Police Department implemented new protocols for implicit bias training, created an independent review board for discrimination complaints, and established a requirement that all officers must verify claims before making arrests in cases involving suspected fraud or financial crimes. Summit Federal Bank did not escape scrutiny either. Brielle used the incident as a catalyst for company-wide reform. She demanded bias training for every employee at every branch, implemented a new system for handling customer complaints that included third-party oversight, and established quarterly audits of customer interactions broken down by race to identify patterns of discriminatory behavior before they escalated. Several other employees with histories of similar complaints to Brooks were quietly let go. The bank also issued a public apology and committed millions of dollars to a fund supporting victims of financial discrimination. Years later, Brielle Hargrove remains the chief executive of Summit Federal Bank. She speaks regularly at conferences about implicit bias in the financial industry and has become one of the most vocal advocates for racial equity in banking. Brooke Simmons works in retail for minimum wage. Her criminal record and viral notoriety make stable employment almost impossible. Officer Grant Ellison has not worked in law enforcement since his termination and has largely disappeared from public view. The Charlotte branch of Summit Federal Bank now has a large portrait of Brielle Hargrove hanging in the main lobby where every customer and employee can see it. Beneath the portrait is a plaque that reads, "Leadership is earned through service and respect is owed to every person who walks through our doors." The lesson was costly, public, and permanent. A black woman should never have to prove she belongs in a space she built. Assumptions based on race cost careers, cost freedom, and cost more than $1 million. And sometimes the only way a system learns is when the cost becomes too high to ignore. If you believe a chief executive should be able to make a deposit in her own bank without being treated like a criminal, share this story. Leave in the comments what changes you think all banks should implement to prevent racial profiling. And if this story reminded you that dignity does not depend on a title, it depends on humanity, subscribe because we will keep telling these stories until assumptions stop destroying lives.